I'm filled with self-doubt, but one must sift through that doubt to remove the unreasonable elements, to seize upon the bits that push you to develop yourself, and then also to sort of discard some of potentially reasonable thoughts because they're just too heavy. They just weigh you down and they stop you from actually doing anything.
Welcome back to Artfully Crafted. My name is Alienor, and each week I travel to a craftsperson's studio, interview them, and show you their work. This week's guest was a little bit of a dilemma, and I wasn't sure whether to interview them. The reason for this is that Maximilian is my husband. Therefore, I know I'm so biased about his work, and there's really no getting away from it. However, I also know that what he makes and how he makes it is quite unique. And I also know that there are difficult topics I can bring up with him, such as the anxiety of being a maker, that someone else might understandably not be comfortable discussing with him. So here we are. I should add that having decided to interview him, it was also really difficult to do so because I had to essentially pretend that I didn't really know the answer to every single question I was asking. And I was trying to remain professional, but I think it just results in me looking a little grumpy. Anyway, this week, we're off to Park Royal to meet Maximilian A. Shapiro, an architectural miniaturist working in plaster. So I think we've done this like 20 times now, is how do I introduce you? Because you're my husband, so it feels very odd saying, hi, Maximilian. But I do have to present you as an artist. So your artist name is Maximilian A. Shapiro.
Yes.
And also the other funny thing about this setup is that we're not in your studio because you have a wonderful and mighty but tiny studio in Gorst Studios, and so we actually couldn't get the sort of right angle to be able to be in conversation and also being filmed. So
we could have filmed it through the window, but that would have been weird.
Yeah, exactly. So we're very lucky actually that James, who's been directing all the films, has lent us his backdrop to do this. But yeah, so let's get into it. So if you could start by telling us a bit about the materials that you're using, the theme of your work, and the method.
So I'm an architectural artist in plaster. As you can see here, I make the facades of buildings in all sorts of materials before I make molds of them, and then I cast them in plaster so that you can hang them on your wall, because no one has enough horizontal space in their life for full models of buildings. So what I enjoy about that is that when people ask me, oh, what material do you work in? The answer is, well, anything that is impermeable, because as long as it'll survive going under silicone, I can use it for some effect, because the final piece will be cast in plaster. So for example, for this piece here for Lincoln, the actual border itself was cardboard that I then waterproofed with sellotape. Just normal clear sellotape. And then after I made the initial plaster cast, I was able to smooth off any like ridges and lines from where the sellotape met in the plaster prototype. But otherwise, my general process, my stereotypical process, is to model the building in 3 dimensions, either from photographs or from visits and sketches and stuff. Model it in 3D print the sort of architectural parts, so anything square and rectilinear, and and make sure that the proportions and the symmetry are correct. And then I can sculpt the detail using a mixture of polymer clays. So mixture of milliput and jomfix, both of them from Silcreate, and that I sculpt like one sculpts well, miniature figures and such, so that I can build up whatever organic details or statuary or figures on the frontages, to then go under silicon, make a plaster prototype, and then carve and smooth off and refine that plaster prototype before I make a final master mold in silicon.
And I think it's important to say just how much goes into the digital drawing, because I think a lot of people think that a digital drawing is sort of like an easy shortcut. But you've told me before how even just like the order in which you draw things and the way they connect to each other in the drawing actually really impacts the 3D print. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's been a huge learning curve for me. At first I remember my very first one, Bishopsgate, I thought, well, I can just do these separate chunks. Like I can do a column and then copy it and then just sort of put them next to each other and make something, a 3D model that kind of looks like the building. And then when I imported it into what's called the slicer, the program that tells the 3D printer how to actually follow a track and build it up, it got confused as to what was and wasn't the outside. And I spent as much time again tweaking it so that the slicer could understand it as I did building it originally, and so that was a false economy. And just every time I've tried to take a shortcut, I've found it to not be such a shortcut because it ends up being a very long fix. To the point that now I've gone from working in Blender, which is a free software, to working in SketchUp, which is paid for but is better for architecture and streamlines a lot of stuff. But I have to be really careful about my geometry hygiene and making sure that everything is a single skin with no errant faces or lines or things. And if you've done any 3D modeling, that's non-trivial and just requires constant going over things, checking things, making sure, because the computer does all kinds of weird stuff and it's trying to approximate what it thinks you want to do. As for being a shortcut, it is a shortcut compared to having to draw everything by hand and sculpt it carefully in clay and work everything up. But all that means is that it goes from being 50 hours to prepare the first phase to being 10 hours to prepare the first phase. To keep my work within a manageable price point, one has to leverage as much modern technology as possible. And that's where it really becomes about focusing about where I, in my hand as a maker, adds value. And that's the statuary, that's the organic elements, that's the bits that require a bit of
flourish, I guess.
A flourish, a flow, a sense of being. Whereas the squared off bits, yes, you could say, oh, well, it's amazing that he did this all so precisely and all the rest of it, but at the end of the day, no one wants to pay for that sense of, oh, well, isn't it nice? Because it's just part of it. It's the background to the actual architectural detail.
There's a work of interpretation that goes on with that.
Yeah, surprising amount, more than I thought when I first went into it. I thought it was just turn up and do the building. But I grew up in London and I love urban spaces. And I love urban spaces because they are the result of thousands of individual choices by people who've never met each other. And yet it all rubs against each other and rubs along and builds and adapts against itself. And buildings are fascinating for that reason. And the longer you look at them, the more you notice. Even magisterial, monumental architecture, which is designed as a holistic thing and meant to be symmetrical and all the rest. And then you start looking at things like, well, they've changed one of the windows because it broke and they weren't going to change them all, were they? So and you start noticing these little evidences of human existence and passing time and individual lives and caretakers and people modifying things, maybe with permission, maybe without, and so on. And so for me, entering the interpretation phase, you have to think about what do you and don't you include? And that is not just in the macro sense of which part of the building do I model, but also in the micro sense of how am I making a replica of what's there, or am I making a representation of the building? And so each building I've done has had different answers to that. Britannia, for example, is one of the longest buildings in the country. It, depending on who you ask, it has the longest internal corridor in the Navy or the military or Europe or, funnily enough, no one has an actual answer. But it's really wide, and funnily enough, this piece isn't 6 feet long. So where did I cut it off? And I ended up deciding that I would cut it off one bay into the colonnade that separates that central core, because I wanted to show that there was a colonnade. I didn't want it to feel like it was just a completely freestanding mess building, but I couldn't do the whole colonnade, so I cut it off there.
And it also didn't really make sense to do that, right?
Yeah, because you wouldn't really be able to see anything. You'd basically just have a long, lumpy line.
Yeah.
Whereas with Petra, the question was, do I do the Petra they built?
Yeah.
Or the Petra you visit today, because of the erosion. And having found some drawings from 1830, I was able to reconstruct the statuary, because it's had 200 years more erosion since then, and more visitors and more people touching it and so on. And so I decided that rather it would be better to make it, basically there wouldn't be any detail to show, it would just sort of be like lumpy little bits on the face, and I didn't think that would have any visual appeal. So instead, I've made a Petra that you can imagine seeing if you visited it, but also give a sense of how beautiful it was when it first was made. And then for Lincoln, the problem I had was, how far do I represent the asymmetry of it? Because each tower was built by a separate team, as well as the fact that the core, because Lincoln Cathedral has an earlier core, I don't know the dates, and then, so it has a Romanesque core with a Gothic extension. And you can really see the division, and one of the things that you can really see about the division is how the Romanesque core has slumped, and so a lot of the horizontals aren't horizontal anymore, and they sort of irregularly go up and down, and I've got to think about the client's wallet here. And I had to decide, do I spend an extra 10 hours modeling every up and down, or do I make it a horizontal as the builders clearly intended it to be?
Right.
Because it's a horizontal line, it's a repeating pattern. And I went with that because the level of scale I was working at, it wasn't going to add value. And if the point is to make a vision of the cathedral that you remember going to, humans actually allied over all this stuff in reality. Yeah. So that's the interpretation aspect.
Can you tell us a little bit about your sort of how you developed, the method that you work in? Because it's not really something that you'd seen someone else do, and it's sort of bringing traditional skills and 21st century methods.
So the genesis of it is that I started sculpting miniature figures. And so that's where I learned to work with the polymer clays. And so that was sort of the core skill set that I have developed over many years as a hobby. And the one thing I was set on is that I wanted to make tiny buildings. I love miniature buildings, but the well-known problem with it is that they take so long that either you have to charge extortionate amounts of money, which is only really accessible to a very select few clients, or you can never make a profit. You can never actually pay your time. And if I wanted to make a living, I had to be able to pay my time, and I wasn't going to break into the very highest end of clients immediately. So I had to find a compromise there. And that's why, as a very techie guy, previously done a bit of 3D modeling and always been interested in 3D printing, but never had a reason to take the plunge. I started playing around with these ideas of mold making, so using a mold to have a reproducible piece, but also how was I going to most efficiently get, from A to hand sculpting. And that's why I started with the 3D printing, and sort of just explored that avenue. And at first I thought I could 3D print a lot more than I could. So a lot of the learning curve was finding that balance point. And also, trusting my own hand sculpting, because I thought that I wouldn't be as good as the computer. So the very first Bishopsgate I did, I tried to 3D model the dragons that sit on top of the gate. They looked a bit crap. I've since remastered the whole piece, redone the whole piece, and sculpted the dragons by hand. And they just have life to them that the original ones didn't. The original ones were very flat and crooked. So, yeah, where was I inspired to do it? There wasn't any one source of, oh, that's what this guy does. It's just, I've spent many years self-teaching myself different hobby skills. And so the idea of just giving it a go and experimenting with stuff became very normally to me.
Do you want to delve into that, how you came to become a maker and a sort of long winding road, I guess, because as a child you did Warhammer, and that's, I think you say that's kind of like as far back as you can think of you sort of engaging with creativity, right?
Yeah, me and basically every other nerdy boy born between 1992 and 1995. Warhammer. Yeah, so the thing is, I played Warhammer as a kid, and then when I was 13, I discovered the cadets and never looked back. And I set my sights on joining the army, and that was my hobby for my whole childhood after that. You know, cadets and then OTC at university and everything else. And then when I actually did join the army and I finished Sandhurst, I realized I didn't have a hobby anymore because I had a job. So what was I going to do in the evenings? And I toyed with the idea of going back to Warhammer, but I didn't really want to have to paint the same figure over and over again to make an entire army. That was something that challenged me even as a kid. I get, bored of having to just go through the same steps. I know a lot of guys find it very soothing and they can get into the zone with army painting, but I don't. Probably something to do with my ADHD. But it is very difficult for me to just do the same repetitive motion over. So I thought, well, what if I bought, the character figures and I painted those, and then I could really, do something different each time. I thought, yeah, but they are very expensive. What if I made them? Someone's got to sculpt them in the first place, right? And so I started Googling, and I found this fabulous site, which was a white background with dark blue text and JPEGs that were sort of off-center because they probably used HTML to center it, but then they'd left a vestigial column for the links on the side, so it actually was off-center. Anyway, that's the level of website we were looking at, but it had a great tutorial on making a wire armature and applying the putty and working it up, and I started going along with that, and I loved it, and that sort of really took me forward, because what really called out to me, and something that I still enjoy about my work, is that you go through different skill sets, one after the other, as you go through a single project. So as soon as you start getting bored of X, you have to move on to Y, Once you finish the wire armature and measuring things out and being precise, you can then get into lumping on clay and being a bit more fun with it. And once you're like, I wish I could finish sculpting that, you finish sculpting, and then you start painting instead. And so it evolves. It evolves with it. But also that then led me, so I finished some figures. I then made smaller figures. Once I made the smaller figures, I thought, what about presentation bases? And so I started doing, more presentational pieces. And then I thought, what if I put these into a diorama? And so then I was sticking pieces of balsa wood together and cutting out individual bricks and PVA gluing them onto the wall. That was a mistake. It looks great. I was really ready to finish with bricks by the time I was on that wall. And also the fun part was it allowed you to explore all these different realms of craft. I'd like to give a shout out to the dollhouse making community. They have incredible detailed tips about how to make things look like things. And that's where I got the sandpaper for bricks idea. You sort of paint it red and then you cut them out. But yeah, very much a hobby approach. Or it's either a hobby approach or you're a full-time professional. There's not really any middle ground for having to cut out individual bricks. But then I went from that. As I got a bit more time and more adventurous, I also started experimenting with completely different fields. So I did some ceramics. I did a lot of carpentry for a while once I had a garage, as well as textile work, sewing, embroidery, a broad range of different hobbies. And they all taught me something.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's something I could I think that's basically the point at which we met, is when you were, I think you were at sort of a diorama stage, and then you kind of started to explore. And I think it also kind of aligns with a period of time where, because we got together and then you were coming with me to all these museums and you were getting sort of more exposure to a broader range of different art forms. And so, I mean, not that I'm taking credit, but I do think probably that inspired you to try different things that you might not have considered.
No, I think that's probably very true. I mean, one of the biggest transformations for me, when I was a kid, I found art museums very boring. I now realize that it's because I'm not a two-dimensional artist. I do remember that as a kid, I was taken to one of these like private collection museums where there was jewelry next to cups, next to chests, next to, that kind of thing. And that was a revelation for me. But then once you and I started going to art museums and you started educating me more about it, but also we started seeing that there were other sorts of collections and the places where it sort of blends, like an altarpiece is both a fabulous bit of carpentry and also painting and also storytelling. And yeah, there's always been these blended art forms. And that's, and I think I don't give you enough credit for inspiring me to experiment with all these different things. Like I always knew I wanted to try carpentry, but that's because big manly man do carpentry, but yeah, the ceramics, for example, is not something I would have thought of if we hadn't gone to the Jackfield Tile Museum and I'd seen encaustic tiles and tried my hand at making those with ceramics. It didn't work.
But I think I do like in a way, because you did, because you were in a job and you were using your free time and you had some disposable income that you could use towards those materials in that trial and error, it was, it was almost kind of like your art foundation degree in a way, because it was your period of like carefree experimentation in a way that you maybe don't have so much now, or that you're trying to get back in a way. Because if it was something that you didn't like, you could say, okay, and move on to trying something else. I think that was a really key period for you, probably, looking back.
Yeah, that was one of the hardest lessons for me to learn, actually, was that I didn't have to finish everything to the highest level of perfection once I'd started it. That was a very difficult lesson to unlearn. Because, I went to the kind of academically demanding school where you weren't allowed to just, didn't work for me, leave it. And that's good. For a 15-year-old in an academic setting, that's absolutely what you need to learn. But for whatever reason, I took that really to heart for all of my personal projects and personal things. And so I would become very frustrated and obsessive, and it also then became a real block because I wasn't going to continue with this project. I didn't like doing it. And so therefore I just did no project, and then I didn't create anything. And so learning to get past that sense of having to be a perfectionist and also be a completionist, if that makes sense. And then also dealing with the subsequent senses of guilt that, I never finish anything, I never do anything right. It was, well, you were there. It's a fun time. But that's an important lesson for anyone who's starting out in art, is that, one, it's about the overall effect. It doesn't have to be perfect. And you will always see more mistakes than the viewer does. And two, not all forms of art are created equal for the artist. Each individual will have their different things that do attract them. So like I say, I'm not about 2D stuff, but I really like geometric pattern and construction and working with a straight edge and compass. I don't like painting. I am not good at painting, and I don't really work with color. I don't think in color, and I see in line, not in color. And so it's coming to understand what does and doesn't work for you, and not putting yourself down about it, but instead leaning into your strengths and understanding your weaknesses.
Do you want to talk about the V&A within that, and how that's been a good source of inspiration as well?
Yeah, I've always loved the V&A, and as a kid, it was just a treasure trove. A wondrous place full of beautiful things. But as I grew older and began to appreciate it more as what it's meant to be, as a collection of design to inspire designers, it became a real haven's the wrong word because I always leave uncomfortable, having seen fabulous works of art and wanting to replicate them or meet their level in a way that is useful but doesn't feel good. But it's definitely a place I default to going, and I now have a V&A membership, which is lovely because it means I can go to the exhibitions and take people with me and stuff. That's really a big one. But also it's just a place where I feel comfortable to just wander around, and I don't think I've ever been to the V&A and not seen something I haven't seen before, either because I didn't notice it in the vast spread of stuff that is there, or because they are adding and changing the galleries and moving things around.
Yeah.
So yes, the V&A has been really inspirational. In fact, one of the things that it has inspired me to do is to sort of try a new tangent with my work, because I've always admired those medieval carved ivories. Obviously, I'm not going to go out and carve any ivory, and also carving is not my strong point. Building up is my strong point, but plaster casts could look a bit like ivory, especially since I learned how to add pigment to the plaster to change the color a bit, so you could get it a bit yellowish. But yeah, so I then started working on a more artistic work, because I think that these are...
You're referring to the votive plaques?
Yes, the votive plaques.
V&A.
Yes.
Which section of the V&A is that in?
That's in medieval Europe.
Fine. So it's kind of like the icons section?
Yeah, when you walk in the grand atrium, you go down and you go right and down.
Yeah. And
it's there amongst the reliquaries and the carved woods. It's temporal collection, but they have things like, the altar icons that open and it's all carved ivory, and you're like, how did you do that? I can try and sort of imitate the form factor, but we'll see where that leads. I just think I'm able to do more of a storytelling angle with this format.
Because I think that ties in with, because you come with me to the Art Workers Guild, and there was an evening called the Salon of Doubt, and someone said something that really resonated with you, and it's kind of like led you down this path, right?
We were listening to Jed talk about his practice and how he had recently had a crisis of faith, as it were. He said, I think everyone in here is a storyteller in some way or other. And he felt that signwriting wasn't telling a story, and he wasn't being able to express himself as a storyteller. I've seen him since, and he's now looking at doing illustration and developing his illustration skills so that he can do that storytelling aspect. At the time, I was sat there and I said, that's the problem I have with my work. I enjoy the buildings. I really love the challenge of each new building, but it also isn't artistically fulfilling. Like, I'm constantly hankering after free time to make other things. Why? What is the thread? And for me, it suddenly clicked that it was the storytelling aspect. I've always been a fantasist in that I make stories up and I'm always daydreaming about different things. And so I wanted to bring storytelling into my work. And that's why the votive plaques, I've always loved their form factor and that sort of emotional baggage that religious iconography has. But I'm not a strictly Christian man, and so I don't feel like I can make Christian icons. It would be improper. But I can make things up, and so I started on a series of votive icons to non-existent gods. So like the first one of the series was the god of hosting, and there's little scenes in the corners, like you get scenes from the life of Jesus, but instead it's scenes from hosting, and so it's a dinner party or a barbecue or watching a film together, and the idea was that by that I can also start playing around with detail, and so that when, as the viewer, you see it and you want to go back and look at it again because there'll be something you hadn't noticed or some little detail or something. And anyway, that's the idea. We'll see if I actually manage to pull it off.
I think it does make sense because each of these was a commission from someone for whom that building has a story already attached to it, and so it's not necessarily, you know, artistically for you doesn't have the same meaning as it does to them, because the story is with them, not with you. Whereas I think what you're doing now is you're the one ascribing the story to your work. I can see how that evolves and how you will, I mean, I don't know how your career as an artist is going to develop, but it does seem like there's space probably for both still, of doing commissions for people who particularly love a building, but also you doing a sort of more sort of narrative-led pieces.
I'm always happy to do commissions because it is a cool challenge and I do enjoy doing it, but to do it off my own bat, speculatively, that's where I've had to draw that line, and that's why I'll make more artistic stuff in the off season, as it were.
Yeah, because otherwise you're sort of making something and it doesn't have a purpose. Something that you have not, I think, openly mentioned, but you've kind of hinted at through what you've said, is almost that sort of like anxiety from looking at other people's work and visiting museums, and that sort of duality of I really need to get inspiration and learn by looking at others' work, but at the same time it's sort of anxiety inducing. And I think that's something we come up against, particularly when we're away on holiday. You sort of get itchy hands.
Well, this is where you can tell the interviewer is my wife, because most interviewers wouldn't know this happens. But yes, I will inevitably go into a museum and come out fretting about how I'll never be as good as these great masters, and I have to remind myself, it's literally museum quality work. Like, and even the great masters didn't make exclusively museum quality work. And definitely not in the first 2 years of their career, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I reassure myself with all these things. But yeah, I find that I do struggle with the anxiety of it. But the end result is that I'm left striving towards it, but I have to balance it. I have to go to the salon of doubt. I'm filled with self-doubt, but one must sift through that doubt to remove the unreasonable elements, to seize upon the bits that push you to develop yourself, and then also to sort of discard some of potentially reasonable thoughts because they're just too heavy. They just weigh you down and they stop you from actually doing anything. I recall a great tip I had once was that the difference between rumination and thinking something over is whether you take notes. You know, it's that idea that you're going to have a productive outcome from these transient anxieties, because otherwise you'll forget it. It'll just wash over you and you'll have felt bad and not got anything out of it, and then it's gone. Like, the time moves on anyway.
So there's also your studio is something that we could perhaps talk about. We realised maybe quite early on that emotionally it would be quite beneficial for you to have a separate space. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So I did enjoy working from home, although it had practical challenges when you're working with plaster. But then when I did manage to get a studio in Gorst, after I started getting some more routine commissions, I realised how much I had missed just having people like in the vicinity. I'm lucky enough to be in the corridor next to the, I was about to say smoking area, the fire escape, down to the garden, but that's where people, they go stand on the fire escape to smoke. Just having people walk past, say hello, pop in and pass the time for a bit was something I was really missing, being alone at home, especially in London. All my friends are busy. We might see each other once a week, twice a week if we're really lucky. Once a week is pretty lucky. And so you take for granted how much of your social life ends up just being your workplace. And so it was really good to be back in a community, not just because of all the, the writ large elements of being in a community of activities and mutual support and cross-promotion, all the rest of it, but even just the small things of seeing other humans walking past the window and being able to smile and say hello was pretty crucial.
Yeah, and I guess as you say, there's also that like collaborative, creative aspect of exchanging ideas, even if it's someone who's not, from the same discipline as yours. They might, in their approach to their practice, or as you say, the sort of 80% around the 20% exploration, there might be some overlap in the 80% that you can sort of talk about, right?
Yes, absolutely. We had one ceramicist who was very interested in my ability to just pour plaster onto anything. He actually brought in a takeaway tray from one of the sushi places, so it had sort of a chrysanthemum pattern stamped at the bottom of it. I just poured plaster into that, and that allowed him to take reverse presses for his ceramics, as well as people coming in and asking about mold making, and me being able to look at other people's tools and processes, especially in Gorst, where there is a big variety of different art forms. That was very stimulating.
You're mostly self-taught, but you did sort of learn from different sources, whether that's online or in person. Do you want to maybe mention some of those and how they fitted in to you developing your approach?
Yeah, to be fair, I think the term self-taught undervalues all the materials that I had to use to self-teach, right? One of the greatest resources I've found is archive.org. Around 1900, there was a huge boom in autodidactic texts. People just writing books about how to, draw and do lettering and do this and do that, and they're all on archive.org and they're all free. And so that's very useful. And then, of course, YouTube, and as I mentioned, these obscure websites that are harder and harder to find. Still there, they're just harder to find. But there's only so far you can take your self-teaching, because the best example I have is mixing plaster, which should be really obvious. But I was lucky enough that Geoffrey Preston, fabulous sculptor and plaster caster, makes wall-sized murals. I got to spend half a day with him, and when you look up how to mix plaster, it says, put your water first, sift your plaster into the water, and then mix it, etc., blah, blah, blah. Now, I thought to myself, I will be, because I'm working in miniatures, I'll be real precise, I'll be real special about it. I'll take a sieve, and I will sieve the plaster into the water to make sure there are no lumps.
Right.
It takes so long to sieve it in, it's starting to set by the time you finish sieving it in, especially when you realize you're doing like 2 kilos of plaster. But also, this is the worst part, it doesn't even mix right, because actually it needs to be a bit thicker than that. It goes on too fine, and it disperses, and it doesn't really mix, and so it categorically doesn't work. You need to sift it in with your hand, but you can't really see that in the videos, because even if you watch someone do it, you don't know what is and isn't important.
Right.
Until I went down and said, okay, well, this is what I'm doing. And they looked at me and went, why are you doing that? You just do this. I went, oh.
And so that was with Geoffrey and his team.
With Geoffrey and his team, and it just worked perfectly. And I went, oh, okay. And so that's the point at which that tuition becomes really invaluable, to just smooth out all of the edges where you're having to put things together yourself. Maybe they're just not aligned correctly. And also, luckily, that's where short courses become really helpful and really handy. That sort of practical element where it goes beyond what to do and what order to do it in, and into how to do it and how to do it just so.
Yeah, I guess you can self-teach in theory, but I guess there comes to a point where just the sort of last few strides of learning, where you actually need the practical, you kind of need to like feel your way to that, don't you? And having someone actually demonstrate it, you can just see that in person much more clearly.
There's an old quip that in theory, there is no difference between practice and theory, but in practice there is.
That's so true. And actually it's not so much you watching them, it's also like them correcting you, right?
It's very much them correcting you.
So we've touched on the fact that you're working on your votive plaques, your own version, but what would be, going back to the architecture, what would be your sort of dream commission, a building that you love?
My dream commission? Anything Victorian or Edwardian Baroque. So I've found, some people have asked me about modernist buildings, and I find that the problem with modernist buildings for me is that their main architectural interest comes from their massing and their blocking, and the overall sense of them as a building. That's one of the reasons that the true modernists, the pioneers, were just so brilliant as architects, because they were able to envision the whole thing And then you move into brutalism and well-executed brutalism, where it's about laying bare the function of the building through its external representation and so on. It's like awesome. It really doesn't work when you have to flatten it down into about 2 centimeters maximum of depth, because otherwise they'll fall off your wall.
Yeah.
Whereas I personally love Edwardian Baroque and high Victorian neo-Gothic stuff because it's full of detail and it draws my eye and there's all kinds of fun little stuff. But also it works best for this. So the one commission I really wish I got would be the St. Pancras Railway Hotel. Because
I thought you were going to say that. Yeah.
Love that building. It's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anything that people should bear in mind when commissioning you in terms of limitations of the materials or the approach? You know, you've talked about having to adapt things. So is there anything like that people should bear in mind?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to be clear on before you approach me is, where do you stand when you look at the building? Because one can say, oh, I'd like this building. And sometimes it's really obvious, you know, because monumental architecture especially is built for you to stand in one place and look at it. But for other buildings, it may be less obvious, and to understand sort of kind of what your left and right of vision is for the piece and so on. Effectively, how would you frame this photograph? Because I'm going to literally go out there and frame a photograph and work off that and try and draw an elevation and so forth. I think oblique perspective doesn't work so well in my medium because you're trying to combine three-dimensionality with fake three-dimensionality. I think you could do it, but I think it would feel weird to have it in perspective but also physically coming towards you, because there would be actual perspective fighting with forced perspective. So it works best like a squared on view, which can be a challenge. Lincoln, for example, is set into a square. It's physically impossible to walk back far enough from the front to get a single shot of the entire front. I had to build this off photographs that are taken from the castle across the valley to get the top part as square on as we can get. And that's a very common shot of Lincoln, actually, because it's beautiful, and you get the top of the houses and such. And then I went on Google Maps and street viewed the bottom, having to like draw it up and match it up and make it all work. Nice. So I can achieve what is actually impossible in reality, which is to give you this elevation there.
I mean, these obviously take a long time to work on, but because of the process, it's not, you know, you wouldn't say sort of 40 hours and say, oh, it's going to be done in a week, right? It's actually kind of very much spread over a period of time. So how long would you say?
I'd say
timeline?
Lead time would be, if I was working on this full time, it would be about 6 weeks. Or I could do an express in 4 weeks.
Fine.
But
that's if the 3D printer doesn't break down.
No, that's taking
materials.
No, that's taking into account the stuff. No, the thing that makes it an express in 4 weeks is me not sleeping. So you know there is a surcharge for that, but you know it is possible to push oneself and get it done in time, but less than 4 weeks because of things like breakdowns. Like the silicon takes 48 hours to set, and I need to do that twice. So that's already 4 days that are just out the window, and so. The inevitable breakdowns, things taking longer than expected, etc., means that I've never been able to do something in less than a month.
Yeah, I was not expecting that actually. The amount of time you would spend, you know, on the 3D printer. Like I thought, I mean, I don't know anything about 3D printers, so I kind of assumed it was like, you know, you do your drawing, you press the button, and it's easy. But actually, I feel like you spent a lot of time sort of looking after this 3D printer, and it's quite technical, right?
It's not as technical as it used to be. You know, my heart goes out to those pioneers of 3D printing who are physically building every component themselves and trying to figure out the software and stuff. You know, I'm on easy mode compared to them, and even then, it's a funny old machine, and also I'm not using the most advanced one. So there's a lot more there are far more reliable machines out there on the market, and they cost 17 times as much.
Fine, yeah.
But that's because that's for the kind of professional 3D printing houses where time is money and it's worth paying for that, whereas I'm an artist. So yeah, I do spend a lot of time figuring out bed leveling and changing nozzles and stuff. But I was aware that that was probably going to happen. I was always told that once you get into 3D printing, the 3D printer becomes its own hobby, let alone whatever you're printing. Yeah.
Fair enough. Is there a way in which arts and crafts are taught at school that kind of influenced how you viewed it and your approach, and the fact that you didn't experiment with it until later in life?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, the biggest change I would want to see is a removal of this hard delineation between art and what now is called design technology, or at least it was when I was going through school. And the idea that in art class you paint and you draw and maybe you sculpt if someone knows how to do that and teach that. And then in crafts you do carpentry and enameling and all other kinds of fun, cool things, which, to be fair, if you go to a museum, like you go to the V&A, there's jewellery in there, but it's not taught in art class. Art class never touches upon jewellery as an art form.
Yeah.
Or enameling as an art form, or all the people that you're interviewing in your series of videos as art forms.
Yeah.
And I think that would have radically changed my perspective on things if I had felt that it was appreciated in that way.
Yeah, so there's a problem with sort of the perception, how it's presented as one being higher than the other, I guess.
Well, it's definitely that side. I mean, the fact that the term fine art exists to differentiate from unfine art, you know, or even, God forbid, craft.
Well, thank you so much for for doing this with me, and yeah, I hope that you do get the St. Pancras commission, because we've been talking about it for a long time, and that would be really, really cool.
Yeah.
So. I would love to hear about people's experiences of art and DT lessons at school in the comments below to start a conversation about art teaching in primary and secondary education. Thank you for watching, it means a lot, especially as at this moment, this channel is entirely self-funded. So please spread the word and subscribe. See you next week.
Hi, welcome to my cooking channel.